There is a moment near the end of Hollow Knight Silksong that stops you completely. Not because of a boss fight, not because of a revelation shouted across a grand stage, but because of something small, a shadow in the corner of a final scene, shaped like something you recognize, a silhouette you last saw descending into the dark beneath the dying kingdom. A shape that should not be here, in this place, in this kingdom made of silk and song and ancient power. And yet, there it is, the night's shade, present, watching, a thread of connection running from one world to another, from the underground of Hallownest to the high citadel of Pharloom, stitching together what we once thought were separate stories into a single, continuous, breathtaking whole. Hollow Knight and Silksong are not simply two games set in the same universe. They are two halves of a story that was always larger than either kingdom could contain. A story about pale beings of immense power, about the children they make and the deals they strike, and the sleeping gods they carry with them everywhere they go. A story about what happens when a mother becomes a goddess, when a daughter inherits a war she did not start, and when the world of insects and void and silk turns out to be far stranger and more deeply connected than any map has ever shown. To understand the connection, we have to go back to the fall of one kingdom and the rise of another, back to the pale beings who shaped both worlds in their image, back to a weaver who once defied her creator and fled to a place called Hallownest, back to where Hornet really comes from.
Before we can follow Hornet into Pharloom, we need to understand the world she left behind, and more importantly, why leaving it alive made her so significant to forces she had never met. Hallownest was not always the kingdom we find in Hollow Knight. Like all kingdoms, it began as something else, a region of the underground world populated by insects living according to instinct, without the weight of higher thought or accumulated memory. They had their own rhythms, their own small purposes, and somewhere in the dream space they shared, the warm and ancient light of the radiance moving through their sleeping minds like a tide. Then the Pale King arrived. He was one of the worms, vast, pale beings of extraordinary power, whose nature the lore of Hollow Knight describes only partially, as though even the game itself finds them difficult to look at directly. This particular worm came to a place called the Cast-Off Shell and shed his old form, becoming something more precise and deliberate, the Pale King. Smaller, more careful, armed with the power of soul and with a vision of what the underground could become. He gave the insects of the underground higher minds. This was the Pale King's great gift, the ability to think, to remember, to accumulate meaning across a lifetime, to speak and build and understand. With this gift came civilization, and with civilization came Hallownest, a kingdom of pale stone and running water, lit from within by soul energy, populated by scholars and warriors and merchants and nobles who had transformed from simple creatures into something more complex than the underground had ever seen. At the center of it all was the City of Tears, perpetually weeping from above, perpetually lit by the soft industry of a civilization that had chosen its king and his gifts without fully understanding what those gifts required in return. What they required, above all else, was forgetting. The radiance had been there before the Pale King. She was ancient, a being of pure golden light who had lived in the dream space of every insect in the underground, a goddess they communed with in their sleep. Before the Pale King's gift of higher minds, the bugs of Hallownest had carried her warmth in them without knowing it, the way water carries warmth from the sun. She was not separate from them, she was woven through them. The Pale King's gift required new architecture in the mind, structure and hierarchy and the bounded self. There was no room in that architecture for a god who existed in the open shared space of dreaming, so the radiance was pushed out, forgotten, her name removed from prayers, her presence expunged from the cultural memory of a civilization that had been guided carefully and deliberately to believe it had always been without gods. She did not accept. She could not act in the waking world. The Pale King had closed those doors, but she could act in dreams, and so she did. The infection spread from her, golden and consuming, reaching into sleeping minds and corrupting them, not as an act of pure malice, though it certainly felt like one to those it touched, but as the rage of something ancient that had been erased, a light that refused to be extinguished, a god who refused to be forgotten.
The Pale King's answer was both brilliant and terrible. He descended into the abyss, the void beneath Hallownest, a place of pure darkness that predated everything, and there he drew out vessels, small, silent beings born of his essence and the void, shaped like his children but made to be empty, made to feel nothing, made to hold the infection without being consumed by it, because there was nothing in them for the radiance to take hold of. He chose the most hollow of all the vessels, the one he called the Hollow Knight. Into this vessel, the Pale King drew the radiance, her infection, her rage, her dreaming golden light, and sealed it within the Black Egg Temple, anchored by 3 dreamers whose sleeping minds held the seal in place. 3 rulers who had agreed, each for their own reasons, to sleep so that the kingdom might continue. One of those 3 dreamers was Hera the Beast, the ruler of Deepnest, the mother of Hornet. The deal that Hera made with the Pale King was precise and personal. She would sleep, give up her waking life to anchor the seal, in exchange for a child. And so Hornet was born, half the pale legacy of the Pale King, half the ancient, dark, deep nature of Hera and Deepnest. The plan, as such plans do, held for a time, and then it unraveled. The Hollow Knight was not truly hollow. No vessel, it turned out, could be perfectly empty. The will that existed in it, born of void rather than soul, was small but real, and the radiance found it. She pressed through that hairline crack, slowly over immense stretches of time, and the infection spread again, leaking from within the seal itself, consuming Hallownest from the inside rather than the outside, golden eyes spreading through the city and the archives and the noble houses, until the kingdom was a shell of what it had been. The Pale King disappeared, whether consumed by the infection or consumed by guilt, or simply unable to face the consequence of his imperfect solution. He was gone. Hallownest continued to die, slowly around his absence. When the night arrived, the small, silent, void-born figure we play as in Hollow Knight, Hallownest was already far along its ending. The journey through the kingdom was, in many ways, a journey through a ruin still pretending to be a civilization. And at its end, in the Black Egg Temple, the knight faced the Hollow Knight and made a choice. In the deepest and truest version of the ending, the one the lore supports most completely, the knight destroyed the radiance outright. Her dreaming light was shattered, the infection ended, the seal became unnecessary,
and Hallownest, freed at last from both the radiance and the terrible arithmetic of containing her, began the process of becoming something else, something quiet. A ruin, yes, but an honest one. The dreamers who had held the seal, Hera among them, were freed in the same moment, freed from their long sleep. What that means for Hera is left unspoken in Hollow Knight, but for Hornet, standing at the edge of the crater above the Black Egg Temple, watching the last act of the kingdom she had protected, it meant that the debt was paid, the deal was done, the obligations that had structured her entire existence were resolved. She was, for the first time, free, and then they came for her.
To understand why Hornet was taken, why beings from Pharloom crossed whatever distance separates the two worlds to capture her specifically, we need to understand what Hornet actually is. Not her role in Hallownest's story, not her function as a protector or a guide, her nature, her blood. Because Hornet is not simply the daughter of the Pale King and a ruler of Deepnest. She is something far more specific and far more extraordinary than that description suggests. She is, in the precise genetic and cosmological sense that the lore of Silksong establishes, the granddaughter of a god. Hera the Beast was not simply a powerful insect who ruled a dark and crawling kingdom. She was a weaver, one of the spiders created by Grandmother Silk, the ancient pale being who ruled Pharloom, to be her perfect instruments of conquest and control. Weavers are divine by nature, granted immortality and total dominion over silk by their creator. They are not simply strong, they are a separate order of being from the ordinary insects of the underground, endowed with gifts that place them closer to their pale parent than to the creatures they live among. At some point, and we will return to why, Hera and a group of other weavers left Pharloom. They fled their maker's kingdom and found their way to the underground, to the region that would become Deepnest. And there, Hera became the beast. She built something of her own. She ruled. And when the Pale King came to her with his deal, "Sleep for me, anchor my seal, and in return I will give you a child," she agreed. We do not know exactly how that conception worked. The Pale King was a pale being, a worm-born god of soul. Hera was a weaver, a spider-born child of a god of silk. The mechanics of their child's creation are left to the imagination, but the result was Hornet. Half pale being, half weaver, the daughter of one divine lineage and the granddaughter of another, the offspring of two completely different orders of cosmic power. This is why Hornet is so extraordinarily capable, faster and more precise than any ordinary insect, wielding her needle with a skill that goes beyond training into something closer to birthright. She is not simply talented, she is the product of two impossibly powerful inheritances meeting in a single small body, and what emerges from that meeting is something the world of both Hallownest and Pharloom has never quite seen before. Grandmother Silk created the weavers with a specific purpose, to be her children, her instruments, her loyal agents in the business of conquering and binding the kingdoms of Pharloom. When the weavers eventually rebelled, and they did, as we will explore, and fled, they did not simply leave empty-handed. They carried their divine nature with them, their immortality, their connection to silk, their song-given power, and wherever they went and whatever they did, those gifts passed forward. In Hornet, they passed forward in a form Grandmother Silk had never anticipated, combined with the Pale King's power of soul, filtered through generations of Deepnest survival, shaped by a childhood at the boundary of two very different worlds. The Weaver inheritance became something new, something that could not simply be claimed or absorbed or bound by silk the way ordinary descendants of the Weavers might be.
This is the threat Hornet represents to Grandmother Silk's awakening, and this is why when the thralls of the Citadel were sent out across the world to hunt down every descendant of the Weavers, Hornet was at the top of every list. She is the most powerful Weaver-descended being alive, and she is completely outside anyone's control. In Hollow Knight, we see Hornet in her function, the protector, the sentinel, the being who tests the night and watches the borders of a dying kingdom. She is defined almost entirely by what she does. What she feels, what she wants, what she believes about herself, these are held very close, if they are expressed at all. She is controlled in a way that reads as discipline, but might also be understood as the containment of someone who has never been in a situation where letting go was safe. In Silksong, she is captured, removed from every context that has defined her, brought to a kingdom she has never seen, built on principles she has never encountered, stripped of her role, her purpose, her familiar landscape. And what emerges from that stripping is perhaps the most important thing Silksong has to say, that Hornet, without her function, is still Hornet, still precise, still fierce, still constitutionally incapable of walking away from something that needs to be understood or a wrong that needs to be answered. The discipline was real, but it was not a mask. She is the same person in Pharloom that she was in Hallownest. She has just never had the space to discover that until now.
To understand what Hornet walks into, we need to understand what Pharloom was before it became what it is now. Because Pharloom was not born as a unified kingdom, it became one. And the story of how it became one is the same story as the story of Grandmother Silk, a story of conquest dressed in the language of devotion. Before Grandmother Silk arrived, Pharloom was a region, not a kingdom, but a landscape. A place that contained many smaller kingdoms, each with its own culture and ruler and relationship to the land they occupied. They were not unified. In some cases, they were in conflict. In others, they coexisted with the particular fragile peace of neighbors who have agreed, through long practice, to leave each other alone. A few of these kingdoms are worth understanding because their fates shaped the Pharloom that Hornet arrives in, and because their people, or the descendants of their people, are still there, living beneath the structures the Citadel built on top of their ruins. In the sands of the left half of Pharloom, the Order of Carax held dominion. They were warriors, a tribe of armored bugs led by Crust King Khan, fierce and proud, occupying a coral tower that rose from the sands like a monument to their refusal to be anything other than what they were. They were not a subtle people. When Grandmother Silk came, they did not negotiate. They fought. They fought until Khan fell, and the last of the Order fell with him, and the coral tower became a ruin that the Citadel built over without ceremony. Further into the landscape, the Scar tribes occupied both the Hunter's March and the Far Fields, a warrior culture of ants led by Hunter Queen Carmelita, whose relationship with the land was one of pursuit and endurance, and the particular dignity of people who measure themselves by what they can survive. The Scar fought too against Grandmother Silk's advance. They lost, as everyone lost. Carmelita became Scar Singer Carmelita. Her title changed, her freedom taken, her abilities repurposed in service of the Citadel's music, an instrument made into a hunter. And then there is Bilewater. The name now belongs to a wretched, corrupted stretch of land that feels like an insult to whatever it used to be. It used to be the home of the Stilken, a tribe of soul-bending bugs led by Groll the Great, inhabiting what must once have been a vibrant and lush region. The Stilken fought Grandmother Silk's conquest too. They lost, and then in the Citadel's construction, the putrefied ducts were built directly below them, all the waste from the vast structure above channeled downward,
dumped onto the ruins of the Stilkens' home, poisoning the ecosystem until the living land became the festering place we navigate with something between determination and despair. It is difficult to visit Bylewater and not feel the weight of what it represents. Not just a conquered place, but a place made deliberately unlivable. Whether that was intentional or simply the indifference of architects who never thought about what lived below their drains, the effect is the same. A culture was not only conquered, it was buried beneath the literal sewage of the civilization that replaced it. These kingdoms matter because they are the texture of Pharloom beneath the citadel's surface. The descendants of these peoples are still there in one form or another, shaped by generations of life under the citadel's rule, carrying in their cultures the memory of what they once were, even if that memory has been transformed by time and oppression into something barely recognizable as its origin. When Hornet moves through Pharloom, she is moving through a landscape of buried histories. Every region she passes through was once something else. The citadel did not simply build on empty ground, it built on people.
Now we come to the center of everything. The pale being who created the weavers, conquered Pharloom, was put to sleep by her own children and is now awakening again. The being whose hunt for her descendants brought Hornet to a kingdom she had never imagined. Grandmother Silk. She is, in the structure of Silksong's lore, the mirror of the Pale King, and the contrast between them illuminates both characters in ways that neither story achieves alone. They are both pale beings. They are both entities of immense power who arrived in a region not their own and remade it according to their nature. They both created races of beings to serve their purposes, endowing those races with gifts that made them extraordinary and simultaneously bound them to their creator's will. They both built civilizations on the foundation of carefully managed obligation. But where the Pale King's power was soul, gathered, stored, the energy of minds, Grandmother Silk's power is silk. And where the Pale King offered his gift and then stepped back, positioning himself as a beneficent ruler whose subjects were elevated by his presence, Grandmother Silk's relationship to the beings in her domain is more immediate and more consuming. Silk is not offered, it is drawn. It moves through living things and binds them. The closer you are to Grandmother Silk, the more thoroughly the silk in your world is an extension of her will rather than your own. She arrived in Pharloom and she evolved the Pharlets, small arachnids native to the region, into the Weavers. This is worth sitting with. She did not simply create the Weavers from nothing. She took something that already existed, something native to the land, and transformed it into something new. Something divine, something that carried her nature within it and was therefore, by that logic, her children. She told them exactly that. You are my children. You are divine. You are immortal because your nature mirrors mine and cannot be ended by the ordinary processes that end ordinary things. She gave them total control over silk, the ability to weave it into runes and bindings and weapons and scripture, and she gave them the gift of song, the capacity to channel silk power through their voice, a living instrument of her cosmological order, and then she used them to conquer every kingdom in Pharloom. The conquest was not quick and it was not bloodless. The Order of Karax fought to the last. The Scar tribes fought bravely. The Stilken and their leader fought and lost their world in the most material possible sense. Each of these cultures offered resistance appropriate to who they were, and each of them was overcome because Grandmother Silk and her weavers were not simply more powerful in the ordinary military sense. They carried a force that worked on the fundamental level. Silk that could bind, song that could compel, a pale being's light that worked on the consciousness of every bug in its vicinity. After the conquest, Grandmother Silk built the Citadel,
a vast structure at the heart of unified Pharloom, organized around the division of executive power into 3 branches: the conductors, genetically infused with silk, who managed the choir, the army, and the civic apparatus of the kingdom, organized around the music and song that runs through Pharloom's culture the way soul ran through Hallownest's. The architects, robotic beings built from the infused souls of bugs, charged with the construction and maintenance of the citadel's physical structure. And the vault keepers, custodians of the sacred and ancient knowledge held in the whispering vaults, the memory of what Pharloom was and is, and perhaps what it was meant to become. This structure, 3 branches of power, each managing a different aspect of the kingdom, echoes the 3 dreamers of Hallownest in an interesting way. In both cases, power is distributed in 3s. In both cases, the 3 are bound to the will of a pale being whose true nature the ordinary inhabitants of the kingdom do not fully understand. The parallel is not coincidental. It speaks to something about the way pale beings structure the civilizations they build. They do not rule directly, or not only directly. They work through intermediaries, through distributed systems, through the careful management of obligation. There is also the prison, the hospital, the underworks. The slab holds the sinners, those who have transgressed against the citadel's order, the most important of whom was the first sinner, a weaver who turned against Grandmother Silk before the rebellion began and was condemned to an eternity chained in place. The Whiteward is the citadel's hospital, where bugs infuse themselves with silk to extend their lives, a practice that sounds on the surface like medicine, but carries underneath it the implication that the silk doing the extending is not neutral. It belongs to someone. It comes from somewhere, and the bugs who accept it into their bodies are, in some sense, accepting more than longevity. And at the top of all of it, the exhaust organ releases steam through the whispering vaults, and the mist that hangs over Pharloom, that atmospheric strangeness that makes the whole kingdom feel like something half-dreamed, is the breath of the citadel itself. The wraiths that move through that mist are something more personal than atmospheric phenomena. They are the manifestations of the Phantom's will, a being we will return to, made from silk and released into the world through the organ's exhalation. The mist is alive with intent. The air of Pharloom is not neutral.
Here is where the history of Pharloom turns on itself and becomes something more intimate and more desperate than a simple story of conquest and rule. The weavers were Grandmother Silk's children. She created them. She told them they were divine. She gave them power and purpose and the certainty of their own immortality. And then she used them to do her work in the world, to conquer and bind and maintain the order she had established over the kingdoms of Pharloom. But the weavers had minds. That was the nature of their divinity. They were not simple instruments. They could think and remember and accumulate understanding. And what they understood over time was that their creator was not a benevolent mother. She was a consuming force. Her silk moved through everything and everyone around her, drawing it toward her will. And the weavers, her closest creations, the ones most thoroughly saturated with her power, were not exempt from this pull. They were subject to it. They were instruments, no matter what she told them about their divine nature. Before the full rebellion, there were signs of the fracture to come. The weavers, recognizing that something had to change, made an attempt to create life outside of their creator's parameters. They built Eva, an artificially conceived weaver created in the Weavinist Atla, contained in a metal cage because her form was silk itself and could not be held by ordinary means. Eva was a profound achievement and a failed one simultaneously. She was real, she was conscious, she could read the natures of others and transform them, but she was not what the weavers had hoped.
She was too strange, too undefined, too far outside the patterns of what a weaver was supposed to be to fulfill the role they had imagined for her. Grandmother Silk, sensing the winds of betrayal, made her own attempt at a solution. She created the Phantom, a being made entirely of pure silk, designed to be a perfect loyal daughter, a defender of her creator who could not be turned or convinced or reasoned with by the weaver's schemes. The Phantom was flawed. We do not know the precise nature of her flaw, whether it was a flaw of capability or of temperament or of something deeper, but Grandmother Silk found her insufficient and sent her to work the exhaust organ. There, the Phantom has been ever since, her will expressed as the wraiths that drift through Pharloom's mist, her presence woven into the atmosphere of the very kingdom that exiled it to its most functional and unglamorous position. Then came Lace, another being of pure silk, this time without flaw. Beautiful, devoted, precise, everything the Phantom was not. Lace was made to be Grandmother Silk's perfect protector, and she fulfilled that role with a completeness that made her one of the most formidable beings in Pharloom. But she was not enough to stop what was coming. The weavers had found their method. Song, the gift Grandmother Silk had given them at birth, the power that ran through their voices and moved silk in the world, could be turned against its giver. In careful concert, in a sustained and deliberate act of creative subversion, the weavers lulled Grandmother Silk to sleep. They sang her down. They took the instrument she had given them to serve her kingdom, and they used it to imprison her in the cradle, binding her sleep with their voices. And then they built a religion around the lullaby. This is the detail that makes the society of Pharloom so quietly devastating once you understand it. The chants and devotional practices that structure the daily life of the citadel, the hymns and liturgies and ritual songs that the bugs of Pharloom perform as acts of faith, are not simply religion. They are the ongoing maintenance of an imprisonment. Every voice raised in what the devout believe to be worship is in fact a strand in the web that keeps Grandmother Silk asleep. Most of the devout do not know this. The faith is real to them. It is the framework of their lives, the structure through which they understand the world. They are singing because they believe, because their parents sang and their parents' parents sang, because the songs are beautiful and the rituals give shape to an existence that might otherwise feel formless and small. They are not complicit in a conspiracy. They are simply following a false faith that was constructed with great care by beings who needed a sustainable mechanism for keeping their creator's eyes closed. The architects of the lie were the weavers themselves, and here too the parallel with Hallownest deepens. The Pale King erased the radiance from his kingdom's memory and built a civilization on that erasure. The weavers imprisoned Grandmother Silk and built a civilization on that imprisonment. Both civilizations rest on the concealment of an old and overwhelming power. Both are fundamentally unstable because the power beneath them is not gone, it is only sleeping. And sleeping things wake. The weavers eventually understood this too. They could not keep Grandmother Silk sleeping forever. The silk of the world still belonged to her, and her influence over it was not extinguished by their song, only suppressed. Slowly, in the margins of her sleep, she was beginning to reassert herself, her consciousness seeping into the silk-infused beings closest to her, drawing them back toward her will. The haunting, the creeping enthrallment that Hornet faces throughout Silksong is this process in motion. Grandmother Silk is not yet awake, but she is reaching, through silk, through the bodies of those who carry it, through the very infrastructure of the kingdom built on top of her sleeping form. And so the weavers ran. They had done what they could in Pharloom, and it had not been enough, and the thing they had tried to contain was going to consume them if they stayed. They scattered. Groups of them fled in different directions, carrying their divine nature and their song power and their silk into the wider world, finding new places to live and perhaps new things to become. One group, led by Hera, found their way to the underground, to the place that would become Deepnest.
We have to pause here and sit with what this means. Hera, the beast, was not simply a powerful ruler of a dark kingdom. She was a weaver, one of the divine spider beings created by Grandmother Silk to conquer Pharloom, who had participated in the rebellion that imprisoned her creator, and who had then fled with a group of her kin into the underground. Whatever Deepnest was before the weavers arrived, Hera shaped it into something that carried the mark of Pharloom's deep culture. The labyrinthine complexity of Deepnest, the biological intensity of it, the way it feels when you move through it in Hollow Knight, like something that is alive in a more fundamental way than the architecture of the rest of the underground, alive and watching and ancient. This quality is not accidental. It is the residue of beings who came from a place where silk and song and divine power were the fabric of reality. How much of Pharloom's culture survived the migration into Deepnest is something we can only partially answer. What we know is that Hera maintained her identity as a ruler, as a powerful being, as something more than an ordinary insect of the underground. She made the deal with the Pale King, and the fact that she was able to make that deal on those terms with a pale being of equivalent cosmic stature speaks to the nature of who she was. You do not negotiate with the Pale King as an equal unless you are, in some meaningful sense, his equal. Their child was Hornet, and here the connection between the two games becomes biological, becomes cosmological, becomes something written into the very nature of the protagonist we have followed through both worlds. Hornet is the granddaughter of Grandmother Silk, half weaver by blood, half pale being by blood, with the gifts of both inheritances present in her simultaneously. Her speed and precision are not simply the product of training. They are the expression of a divine lineage that runs through her from two separate directions. She is, in the precise sense that the lore of Silksong establishes, one of the most cosmologically significant beings alive, which is exactly why she was hunted. When Grandmother Silk began awakening from her imposed sleep, her will extended through the silk she had seeded throughout Pharloom and the world, reaching for anything she could use, anything she could control, anything that was connected to her through the chain of weaver inheritance. The thralls sent out from the citadel to hunt down every descendant of the weavers were not acting on caprice. They were acting on the logic of a pale being's will reasserting itself over every thread it had ever cast into the world. For most weaver descendants, capture would mean enthrallment, drawn back into the network of Grandmother Silk's silk consciousness, absorbed into the hive mind she was reconstructing from the edges inward. For Hornet, the calculation is more complicated. She is too powerful to simply absorb, too strange in her nature, that combination of pale being and weaver, creating something that does not fit neatly into the taxonomy of beings that Grandmother Silk understands. Whether the intention of her capture was enthrallment, control, study, or destruction remains in some aspects a question the game leaves productively open. What is not open is that they found her. In the ruins of Hallownest, in the silence after the kingdom's end, they came for her and they took her, in a cage, across whatever distance separates the underground from Pharloom to the citadel at the heart of the Silk Kingdom. And Hornet, who has never in her life been simply a passenger in her own story, began immediately and without hesitation to fight her way out. The central antagonist of Silksong is not a villain in the simple sense. Grandmother Silk does not scheme or monologue or pursue petty cruelties for the pleasure of them. She is something older and less personal than that, a force of cosmological nature reasserting itself, a pale being whose sleep was imposed rather than chosen, whose awakening is as inevitable as the tide and about as susceptible to moral argument. The haunting that Hornet moves through in Silksong is the physical expression of this awakening. The silk woven throughout the citadel, in its infrastructure, its people, its history, is Grandmother Silk's medium. As she moves toward wakefulness, that silk activates. The bugs of the citadel who have been most thoroughly infused with it, through the White Ward's life extension treatments, through generations of exposure to the citadel's silk-heavy environment, are the first to be claimed. They become entranced, their autonomy dissolving into Grandmother Silk's expanding consciousness, instruments of her will rather than authors of their own actions. This is the haunting's horror. It is not violent in the obvious way. It is quiet. It is the loss of self, thread by thread, as the silk in your body begins to answer to something other than you. The bugs of the citadel who are haunted are not in pain, or not obviously. They are simply elsewhere, present in body, absent in will, singing because they are told to, moving because they are directed, existing as components of a larger organism rather than as individuals. The weavers who built the false religion around the lullaby understood this possibility better than anyone. They knew, because they had lived under Grandmother Silk's rule, what it felt like to have your will subsumed into hers. The elaborate structure of chants and devotion they constructed was not just a practical mechanism, it was a desperate attempt to maintain the last protection against a return to that condition. The tragedy is that it failed anyway. Not immediately, not completely, but incrementally. Over generations, the meaning of the chants was lost. The knowledge of why they were sung faded, replaced by the simpler and more satisfying explanation of faith. And once the chants became faith rather than function, they lost the precise intentionality that had made them effective. The lullaby became a hymn, and a hymn is not the same thing at all. Grandmother Silk reaches through the haunting towards something that the weavers who fled could not have anticipated. Her own descendants returned to her reach. And at the center of that reach, the most extraordinary descendant, Hornet, daughter of Hera, granddaughter of Grandmother Silk herself. The relationship between predator and prey here is also inescapably the relationship between grandmother and granddaughter. Whatever Grandmother Silk intends for Hornet, control, absorption, something else entirely, the connection between them is not simply one of power against power. It runs through blood. It runs through silk. It runs through the long branching chain of pale beings and their children and their children's choices, all the way back to the moment when God evolved some small creatures into something divine and called them her own.
Now we can see it clearly, the hidden connection between Hollow Knight and Silksong that the first game could only hint at and the second makes explicit. Both games are stories about pale beings who built civilizations on a fundamental act of domination. The Pale King came to the underground and gave the insects of Hallownest higher minds, but the gift required the erasure of their prior relationship to the divine. The radiance was pushed out of their consciousness, forgotten, until she returned as infection. Grandmother Silk came to Pharloom and created the weavers, telling them they were divine children, but the gift of their divinity was inseparable from her will. They were made to serve her, and when they understood this and rebelled, the best they could do was put her to sleep, not free themselves from her completely. In both cases, the pale being's gift is real.
The higher minds of Hallownest citizens were genuine. The weaver's silk power and song and immortality were genuine. The pale beings are not simply deceiving the beings they create and rule, they are offering something authentic. But the authenticity of the gift does not negate the nature of the relationship. Both civilizations were built on a substrate of obligation and concealed power, and both were, in different ways, living on borrowed time. The connection runs deeper still through the figure of Hera. She was a weaver, created by Grandmother Silk, participant in the rebellion, fugitive from Pharloom. She fled to the underground, made a life in Deepnest, and eventually made a deal with the Pale King. Two pale beings' orbits intersecting in the dark and producing a child who would eventually become the protagonist of a story neither pale being planned. There is something extraordinary in that lineage. Hornet carries both pale traditions in her simultaneously. The soul-based power of the Pale King, the silk-based power of Grandmother Silk's weaver children, and the void that she also carries somewhere in the marrow of her nature, inherited from the underground itself. She is a convergence of every major cosmological force in this world. Not because anyone planned her this way, not because the Pale King or Grandmother Silk or even Hera sat down and calculated what their choices would eventually produce, but because the world, with its pale beings and their civilizations and their rebellions and their deals and their sleeping gods, eventually concentrated itself into a single small figure who is now fighting her way through a silk-hung citadel toward an awakening grandmother. The question of whether Silksong takes place after Hollow Knight is answered clearly by the game itself. The dialogue makes the timeline explicit. Hallownest's events are past, their consequences present in the world. And at the end, when the Knight's shade appears, it is the most complete possible confirmation. The void-born sibling who descended into the Black Egg Temple is gone from this world in the conventional sense, but not entirely absent, not entirely finished. Present at the conclusion of Hornet's story in the only form available to something that has passed through what the Knight passed through. This appearance is not decorative. It is the lore's way of saying what it has been saying through the whole architecture of both games. These stories are not separate. The threads run between them. The fall of Hallownest sent ripples into a world much larger than Hallownest knew, and those ripples reached Pharloom, and Pharloom sent its hunters, and the hunters brought back the person who is, in ways both genetic and narrative and cosmological, the connection point between every major force in this universe. The Knight and Hornet were raised in different ways by the same king. They are both products of the Pale King's legacy, one the void-born vessel, one the half-weaver daughter. One descended into the dark to end the radiance, one crossed into a foreign kingdom to confront a different kind of old and consuming light. They are parallel figures, differently weighted expressions of the same theme. What do the children of gods do with the inheritance their parents left them? The Knight's shade at Silksong's ending is not saying goodbye. It is saying, I see what you did here, and it matters, and the thread runs between us still.
Silksong does something that Hollow Knight never quite attempted. It shows us that the world is genuinely large. Not large in the sense of having many tunnels to explore. Hollow Knight had that. Large in the cosmological sense. Large with multiple pale beings, multiple divine lineages, multiple civilizations built on different metaphysical principles, multiple sleeping gods, and their long and complicated relationships with the beings they created. The Pale King and Grandmother Silk are peers, not allies, not enemies in any explicit sense we have seen, but beings of the same order occupying different parts of the same world. Their civilizations ran independently for what must have been an immense stretch of time. Grandmother Silk building and then having her kingdom taken from her by her own children. The Pale King building and then watching his kingdom consumed by the force he tried to erase. Both pale beings, both builders, both in the end brought low by the very act of creation, by the children and civilizations and obligations that their building produced. The weavers connect these worlds. Hera's flight from Pharloom and her eventual arrival in Deepnest and her deal with the Pale King, this is the hinge point between the two games. The lore that seems in Hollow Knight to be simple backstory, a ruler of Deepnest made a deal for a child, is revealed in Silksong to be a chapter in a much longer story that stretches back to the conquest of Pharloom and forward to the awakening of the grandmother sleeping in her cradle. What else might the wider world contain? Silksong gestures at this without answering it completely, which is appropriate. A story that answered every question would leave no room for the imagination to keep working after the credits roll. But the implications are significant. If there are two pale beings of this magnitude in the same world, there may be others. If there are two civilizations built on different fundamental metaphysics, soul and silk, there may be others built on other principles. The underground of Hollow Knight always felt like it might be deeper than it appeared. Silksong suggests that the world is also wider. The nature of pale beings themselves becomes more interesting when you have two of them to compare. The Pale King was a transformer. He evolved himself, evolved the bugs around him, built through the gift of higher minds. Grandmother Silk was a creator in a more direct sense. She made the weavers, literally formed them from the existing creatures of her region. Both worked through intermediaries. Both built structures that were meant to last. Both created beings who were given divine gifts and were simultaneously instruments of their creator's will. Is this the nature of all pale beings? Are they all builders, all civilization shapers, all entities who arrive in a region and remake it according to their nature? And if so, what does that mean for a world that contains multiple pale beings operating simultaneously, each reshaping their region, each creating races of intermediary beings, each sleeping or dying or being imprisoned or disappearing? The world of Hollow Knight and Silksong is not simply a world of bugs and kingdoms and old gods. It is a world in the ongoing process of being shaped by forces that operate above the level of ordinary civilization, whose decisions and relationships and conflicts produce kingdoms as byproducts, incidental consequences of beings moving through a world too large for any single map. Hornet moves through this world as someone who has been inside two of its pale civilizations and survived them both. She knows what it looks like from the inside when a kingdom built on a pale being's power begins to come apart. She knows the texture of civilizations that are built on concealed foundations, that require the ongoing maintenance of a lie to keep the thing at the bottom from waking up. She has lived inside one of those civilizations and watched it fall, and now she has walked through another and watched it confront its own buried truth. This makes her, in the world's terms, uniquely informed, not simply powerful in the conventional sense, yes, but more than that, aware, in a way that almost no one else alive could be, of the pattern that underlies both stories. The pattern of creation and concealment and inevitable awakening. The pattern of pale beings and their children and the deals that produce obligations that outlast everyone involved in making them. What Hornet does with that awareness,
Whether it leads anywhere beyond Pharloom, whether her story continues into a third chapter or concludes here, is a question that belongs to whatever comes after Silksong. But the awareness itself is the gift. The understanding, earned through both inheritance and experience, of what the world is actually made of beneath the maps and the kingdoms and the carefully maintained devotions.
Both games end in the same emotional register when you look at them from the right angle. Not triumph, not despair, something quieter and more durable than either. In Hollow Knight, the night descends into the dark, and the radiance is destroyed, and the mist clears, and Hallownest is still. Not saved in the conventional sense. The kingdom is gone, the Pale King is gone, the civilization is ruin, but the infection is over. The thing that needed to be done has been done, and the cost has been paid, and what remains is honest. A quiet underground where things can begin again from whatever survives. In Silksong, Hornet stands at the end of something similarly enormous. Grandmother Silk, sleeping, reaching, the source of the haunting, is confronted. The citadel is changed by what happens there. The silk that held everything in its grandmother's web begins to loosen, or becomes something different, or is redirected, and Pharloom breathes again in the particular way that places breathe when the force that was compressing them is no longer doing so. And the night's shade is there, watching. This small detail carries the weight of the entire arc between the two games. It says, the night made it through. The night's void nature, which persisted beyond the Black Egg Temple, found its way across whatever distance separates Hallownest from Pharloom, drawn perhaps by the connection between siblings, the same way family tends to find family, even in the dark. It says, you are not alone here. The story that happened before this one is not simply past, it is present, in the only form it can take now. And it says something about the nature of both games taken together, that the story of Hollow Knight was always the first half of something, not a standalone tragedy, but a necessary origin. The fall of Hallownest had to happen the way it happened, and the night had to do what the night did, because the daughter of the Pale King had to be freed from her function so that she could become something else, something that could walk into Pharloom and confront a pale being's awakening with the specific combination of gifts and knowledge and earned understanding that only she possesses. The Pale King built a kingdom and tried to seal an ancient power and failed. Grandmother Silk built a kingdom and was sealed by her own children and is now waking up. These are not simply parallel stories, they are the same story told from two different angles. The story of pale beings who create and consume and are undone by the very acts of creation. The story of what the children of those beings do when the civilization they were born into can no longer hold. Hornet is the answer both stories have been moving toward. Not a messiah. That word is too loud and too simple for what she actually is, but something more useful than a messiah. A witness who acts, a being who has seen both pale civilizations from the inside and survived them both and kept her eyes open throughout, who understands the pattern and can therefore do something about it rather than simply be shaped by it. The silk and the soul are both languages for the same underlying reality, that living things are woven through with energy that can be drawn out and used,
that the forces shaping civilizations work on the fundamental level of what lives inside beings, rather than simply on the level of armies and alliances. Grandmother Silk and the Pale King both knew this, both built on it, both were, in their different ways, right about the nature of the world, even as they were wrong about the sustainability of what they built on top of that nature. What Hornet represents, what her story across both games amounts to, is the possibility of something that does not require concealment, a life built on the acknowledgement of what things actually are, rather than the careful management of forgetting. She has watched 2 kingdoms fall from their false foundations. She knows the shape of collapse well enough to see it coming from a long way off. Whether there is a kingdom after Hallownest and after the citadel that can be built on something more honest, that can hold the energy of silk and soul without a sleeping god at its center, without a sealed radiance in its basement, without a lullaby that no one knows is a lullaby, is a question that belongs to whatever the story becomes next. But the thread is there, running from Hollow Knight through Hera, through the Weavers, through Grandmother Silk, through the citadel of Pharloom, stitching both games together into a single continuous thing, running from the night's shade through the dark to wherever Hornet is going. The world is larger than any one kingdom has ever understood. The pale beings have been shaping it longer than any recorded history reaches, and somewhere in the underground, in the space between silk and soul, in the place where a void-born shade watches a half-weaver daughter complete the second chapter of a story that has been building since before either game begins, something is becoming clear. Not finished, not resolved in the clean and conclusive way that stories sometimes promise, but clear. The way things are clear in the dark when you have been still for long enough, not because a light has been turned on, but because your eyes have finally adjusted. The thread continues. It has always been there, patient as silk, waiting for us to follow it far enough to understand what it connects. 2 pale beings, 2 kingdoms, 2 sleeping gods, 1 granddaughter carrying them all.